Hello everybody, and welcome to another episode of Alex's Afternoon Art Show. My god, I sort of dribbled that one out of my mouth. Anyways, I kind of marble-mouthed that one. But today, we are drawing Hellboy. So the last few that I've been doing have been reasonably complicated full-body shots. So it's been a while since I've done a mid-shot. So this time I'm doing a mid-shot, and it's Hellboy. So it should be a little easier because we're doing something a bit simpler in this instance. I suppose technically we're doing profiles again because that's something I suppose I'm going to be talking about here because I talk about it every now and then, but it's not super often. It's not like posing before I kind of beat that one into the ground over how much I talk about that. But anyways, I'll roll the intro and then I'll show you what I have. So yeah. Now, so this is where we're at. As I say, profiles. But before we talk about any of that, I want to first talk a little bit about drawing Hellboy, because Hellboy is one of those characters who can be kind of challenging to draw. Now the reason for that is kind of strange, because despite his sort of simple-ish design, there's a lot of individual elements there that are easy to not necessarily make mistakes on, but sort of lose some of the specific features. So one of the things here which I sort of don't know if I've done quite right is his sort of slumped shoulders. Hellboy isn't specifically like a super huge and buff character. In the comics, he is typically a little bit skinnier, looking at least. He's a little slimmer. He's got very distinctly slumped shoulders and sort of odd proportions in that respect. So I didn't want to just do the comic book Hellboy because it's very difficult to replicate that in. I have a slightly more realistic style, so it's something of a challenge to replicate Mike Mignola's style in a more realistic sense. So I've just gone for something a bit different entirely. I've decided to try and make him look a little bit more movie-ish, but not specifically any one movie in particular. So I haven't over-detailed his face, I think, so he doesn't look too much like the 2019 one. And he's also got his tied up hair and everything like that, so that's more of a original thing. However, yeah, I chose to keep him shirtless. A lot of the time he does wear a t-shirt in the first film at least. And I didn't include the I don't know what you call that part of a coat of where it sort of flaps over the shoulders, where it covers the whole like kind of top of the shoulders. I don't know what you actually call that, but I didn't include that. And you can see the sort of top of his belt here. That's about it. I didn't want to make this too difficult. I'll obviously have to do detailing on the flat horns and then obviously the big hand. So with the hand, this is the thing that I actually found the most difficult to draw, because it's sort of, again, even in the films, it's sort of cartoony looking because he only has 4 fingers on this hand, if memory serves. Yeah, I'm looking at reference here now. He's only got the 4 fingers. So, I also need to think just maybe thicken this out a little bit because you can see here the top of the arm isn't necessarily 100% consistent here. So I can do one of 2 things. I could sort of taper it in a little bit. That might work. Of sort of tapering it in ever so slightly so that I don't have to change the shape of the hand. I also feel like I need to maybe shrink this down a little bit. I feel like I need to sort of shrink the whole thing down a tiny bit. Now I did put it on a separate layer, just to make my life easier. In the base sketch, anyways, just so that I didn't have anything overlapping or anything like that too much. So, realistically speaking, that makes it a little easier, sort of, to do certain parts of it. So yeah, like I mean, there's a few distinct things here where the arm begins like halfway up his forearm is where it sort of begins. So that means it is quite long. That's normally how it looks. It is normally quite long. His big right hand. I made sure to ensure that it is actually his right hand. Yeah, what else do I need to do? Yeah, okay. So one of the things which I suppose isn't really enormous, but it's something worth noting, is the fact that I gave him a cigarette rather than a cigar in the Ron Perlman films, the Guillermo del Toro movies. He smokes cigars rather than cigarettes. Whereas in the comics, cigarettes, and in everything else, cigarettes. So that's just a mild distinction there. But yeah, so profiles. I suppose I may as well talk about that now. So when we say profiles, the way that my head is angled right now is a profile. This is just a straight front-facing profile. Then we have a side profile where it's just the side, and then there's the three-quarter profile, which is something like this, of where it's 3/4 of this side of the face, and then this side as well, where it's 3/4 of the face on show, where a quarter over here isn't visible at all. This sort of side quarter over here, which isn't visible, that's obviously the missing quarter. So then you see this part, see this part, and you see this part. So 3/4. You can get more distinct in certain ways, where you can have tilts, you can have angles, stuff like that. You can have like head tilt over this way, head tilt over that way, stuff like this, where there's just variations on the profile. But yeah, so here I've done a 3/4 profile, head with a front-facing body. And again, this is another thing, is you can mix and match to a degree head profile versus body profile. So you can have 3/4 body, front-facing head, or you can have side body, front-facing head. You can have side profile head, front-facing body, side profile head, 3/4 body. All these different things. That's so whenever you see people say like, oh, 3/4 profile, side profile, all these things, that's what they mean. And I've explained this before, obviously, but it's just the type of thing of where, for someone who hasn't watched the other ones, this might be a place where you get to hear that stuff. But yeah, there's a bit of fluff on my sleeve. Anyways, I'm not sure there's much more I need to really go over here. Yeah, I tried to not make him like super buff or anything like that, because typically speaking, Hellboy isn't particularly buff or anything like that. He's just sort of normally got a little bit of ab definition, which I'll probably have to add a little bit more of that in there. Yeah, that's really the only thing I'll have to add, is a bit more ab definition, and maybe taper in these shoulders a little bit more. They're quite pointed, which isn't necessarily what I want. I sort of want them to be a bit rounder. But yeah. I think that is everything we needed to cover. This should, in theory, be a shorter one. In theory. Because, yeah, there's not as much that I have to do. These profile ones, even the mid-shots, typically tend to be a little easier. Now, the mid-shots can take quite a while, because I've talked about this before. Technically speaking, obviously there's more of the frame being used here than, say, what I've been doing recently, which is using this much of the frame roughly, the area that I'm just sort of tracing with my cursor, which would just be a full body shot in the middle of this canvas, and then most of it, like this area over here, is just blank, or I maybe do some patterning or something like that for the background. But for a mid shot, I typically end up using the amount of space that you're seeing in front of you, with like a decent chunk of the character's body in show, and then only maybe this side or maybe this side without being that isn't used. So realistically speaking, it's quite a bit that gets used in a mid shot. So technically speaking, there's more I have to draw, but there's actually only like 2 or 3 colors I have to do here, so a lot of that stuff shouldn't be too difficult as we're going through. So anyways, without further ado, I'll actually get on with this. I might make adjustments to the sort of size of the arm. I might do some stuff like that. We'll see. I don't know. I'll have a look at it. I'll have a try. Anyways, we'll move on. I'll do these details and then I'll be back to do the colors. So yeah, anyway. Okay, that's our details done, so that wasn't too challenging. It didn't take super long, it was an hour and a half, so realistically speaking, yeah, not too bad, all things considered. So one of the things which I forgot to mention before was that I used, oh god, what was it? So I suppose I may as well just talk through these little things as I'm going here. So I sort of fixed the arm thing. I think it's slightly better. It's a little off in places, but it's fine. Doesn't really matter all that much. Yeah, because obviously this is much bigger, that means our lines are a little messier, a little bit sort of hairier in places. Namely on the arm, especially. On the arm especially, we've definitely got a lot of hairier lines. Along the sort of finer parts of the body, there's definitely hairier lines like that. One of the things, yes, which I meant to mention was that I used two different brush sizes as I was going. So for the sort of primary stuff, I used a brush of a slightly larger size, and then I used my normal brush size for all the sort of finer details. Within this, I especially used it for like the smoke, and then the sort of detailing of the horns and the arm. So I'll need to remember to use a separate color for the horns and arm. I'm trying to think if there's anything I'm forgetting here. There was one thing, other thing which I meant to mention specifically. Now, yeah, as we're going into the colors here, I'm going to try and keep everything very vivid. Try and keep the red nice and bright. I'll probably just use like an orangey color or something like that for the background. Something mild, something which isn't too which isn't too similar to anything we've got currently, but something which isn't ultimately all that crazy. Maybe to have like an orangey color which sort of comes out in a gradient like that. Darkest up here, lightest down here, something like that, just so that our sort of red still pops. Yeah, I sort of extended some of the hair a little bit. I made it a little longer, a little messier. Because typically Hellboy's hair is kind of messy, despite the fact that it's tied up. So yeah, I sort of extended the beard a little bit in these little areas, and I erased down the top of a lot of the hair, so that it sort of has a nice sort of thin into thick with the lines. So it starts out a little thinner again, then gets thick by the end of the lines. So that sort of tapers nicely, and that's a nice. I think that's a nice looking thing to do with hair. Whenever you're drawing it, it's to sort of taper it out, but obviously it's not super necessary unless you're doing something more zoomed in, like this. So these finer details are slightly more important whenever you're more zoomed in. And yeah, as I say, you can sort of get away with a little thinner lines and stuff like that whenever you're dealing with much larger characters like this. Whenever you're dealing with a character who occupies more space on the screen, you can sort of get away with having thinner little lines and stuff like that, stuff which would otherwise get lost if the character were smaller on the page. So I can have these little creases and stuff like that around the eyes, around the nose and stuff like that, so that I can emphasize those sort of those parts of the face and the shape of these things, because that will help me when it comes to shading. Having those little lines and creases and stuff like that definitely helps with getting an idea of what to do with shading. Now I still don't remember what that other thing I meant to say was, so I'll maybe see if I remember it later. It's probably not terribly important. I don't really know what it was. Oh, there is actually one thing which I forgot to put in. I can do it right now because it won't take very long. Yeah, part of the sort of line thickness thing, yeah, the thing that I forgot was just a little seam on the coat. There should be a seam here, roughly, and then a seam here, roughly. So yeah, one of the things with doing something more zoomed in like this is I'm dealing with 50% zoom here, where I would normally be at 60% zoom, 66%. And obviously, because we're doing things more zoomed out, I don't need to worry too much about the sort of the sort of finish of these lines. As you can see, like, these lines are very hairy. here, but it doesn't matter so much because you're not gonna be seeing it from that zoomed in or anything like this. Where a lot of these body lines are all very hairy and messy, but you're not really going to be seeing it from that level of zoom, really, at all. So that's and again, because the character is bigger, it wouldn't really make sense to zoom in that much because you're not going to be getting more out of it that way. So yeah, yeah. But yeah, I did check, and for whatever reason, Hellboy does not have nipples. I did check that, and it was kind of strange, but he does not have nipples. Or if he does, they're borderline invisible on a lot of the reference images that I'm looking at. So I suppose it doesn't really matter all that much, but it is worth noting that I did check that. Because you would probably be able to see part of it here if they were visible. Another thing I suppose is that his coat actually isn't, technically speaking, any one Hellboy coat in particular. Because it's not the movie one, because it doesn't have the sort of overflapping, and then the one in the comics, I believe, it tends to have a sort of, well, it's not dissimilar to the comics one. The comic one doesn't typically have such a big collar like this one does. Yeah, I've given this one quite a large collar, which isn't normally a thing that Hellboy really has all that much, but I thought it'd be interesting to include it. And also, I mostly did it to obscure stuff that I don't really want to have to draw, such as this sleeve in its entirety and all that stuff. But it sort of helps, it adds to the sort of slumped shoulders. Like I also did that, I did emphasize the sort of tapering down of his shoulders. I can even show you here that the lines for the base sketch of the shoulders are much higher. So I brought those down a little bit so he's got more slumped shoulders. And yeah, the sort of thickness of the sleeve here really does emphasize the sort of his size as well as the sort of slumped shoulders. Because whenever you're sort of wearing something which is like a big coat or something like that, and you have your sort of slumped shoulders, that'll all sort of drapes down and it'll still look very thick. But yeah, I think it looks good so far. Anyways, I don't remember what that other thing I was going to say was. Probably wasn't important. I'll just move on. So I'll do these colors, and then I'll be back to do the painted shading, which is probably going to be pretty minor today, because I don't have to do much here. But anyways, I'll carry on. Alright, that is our colours done. That wasn't too challenging. So now it is time for the painted shading. And now, so I've selected a colour palette. It's going to be very sort of the orange to red sort of scale, kind of what we've already sort of got. It's not going to be anything too crazy. It's just sort of going to follow what we already have. So I'll obviously be starting to sort of set that in with the painted shading. Now, I think I'm going to have a high sort of light so that we get those nice little shadows cast underneath the brow. But also the sort of back of the head as well. So I'll have a light, so the idea would be maybe the light source is up here despite the fact that that's where actually the dark is on the background. But yeah, I'd say, let's say the light source is somewhere like up here or something like that. So we still get the, maybe like here or something like that. So we still get the shadows cast underneath the brow and underneath the horns and stuff like that. But, and also the back, and also along the back of the head. But we get the sort of nice front-facing light along sort of these areas as well. I think that should work reasonably well. So yeah, I think that should work reasonably well. That's more or less what I want to go for here. Nothing too crazy. Just try and keep it easy for myself. That's sort of been the name of the game with this Hellboy one. This was supposed to be recorded like just after I did the last couple of them, but I ended up having a bit of a break, so that's part of why this was sort of constructed to be an easy one, because I wanted to have an easy one at the end of the batch. Instead, I have now got an easy one at the start of the batch. So yeah, anyways, I suppose that works all well and good anyways. So I may as well just carry on. I've got my everything prepped in terms of carrying on, so I may as well just move on. So I'll do this painted shading and I'll be back to do the detailed shading and all that other stuff that I do as well. So yeah, anyways. Okay, that's our painted shading done. That was a reasonably quick section. I think I'm going to be having our detailed shading be a little bit heavier this time. I normally don't go too crazy with it, but I might have it be a little bit darker, because the thing which I forgot to mention before, which I remembered, I did actually remember it, is that I wanted to try and keep the shading sort of soft, the painted shading at least, kind of soft, because that's typically how Hellboy is shaded in a lot of the comics, is they tend to keep it sort of subtle with any sort of painting, but that's because it's very heavy on ink, which isn't really what I do, so I'll instead be doing maybe a bit more heavy on the painted, or on the detailed shading, because that might look a little better, and that might give it those sort of defined edges to the shading. Now there was a few things which I tried to do here to sort of try and be conscious of material. So with the horns and the hand, I gave the painting this sort of like kind of dotted, sort of kind of weird like kind of curving. I'm doing the sort of motion with my hand that I used to do it. So it has these sort of kind of blotches and stuff like that. Bits further in, which are a little lighter, and then bits which are further out, which are a little darker, and it's a little bit more obvious here. These sort of little dottings of shading, little tiny streaks and stuff like that, because that makes it look a little bit more like a stony material, something like that, a bit of a harder material, something that's a little bit something that sort of comes across a little bit kind of weirder in terms of its shading, whereas his skin sort of has a bit more of a kind of, again, obviously skin tends to have a bit of a lighter tone to it whenever it's being hit with soft, even soft light typically has a sort of a lighter tone to it. You can even see it with my own face. I look very, very pale with this particular light. But yeah, during the day I look very red for this exact same reason, because of this very same light. But yeah, so yeah. Yeah, I don't think I need to cover too much. The painted shading, yeah, that was that, and then the detailed shading, I'll be sort of, yeah, as I say, maybe trying to go a little bit darker on it. I didn't bother doing any painting on the cigarette because it is not very big, so I felt like it would be a bit of a waste of time to have to go through and do that. I'll just do it in this section. I'll just shade it, yeah, with the detailed shading. So yeah, what have I got to do? I've got to do my detailed shading, I've got to do my light line, and I've got to do my first gradient map. Now obviously I've selected all my my tones for my shading, so I know exactly what I'm doing for that, so that shouldn't take very long. And yeah, basically that'll be us done after that, and we're not even 3 hours in yet, so this has been a pretty quick one, all things considered, which I'm perfectly happy with. There's a plane passing overhead, so I'm just going to carry on, and then, you know, I'll be back to do all the last tiny little bits of stuff, like the last bits of gradient maps and stuff like that. Anyways, I'll move on. Okay, that's our detailed shading, our light line, and our first gradient map done. I chose to do a colourful light line this time. I chose to go for an orange one because that sort of fits our colour tones for the most part. I want to try and do a gradient map that sort of emphasises our shadows, makes them a little darker. So I might actually adjust this and make my darkest colours a little bit darker, because I feel like they're not dark enough. As it stands, just generally make things a little darker. Maybe that'll work for me. Seems a little better. Okay. Right. Okay, so now I need to start making my duplicates. So, next on the list. This is an overlay, actually. I don't want an overlay, I want a soft light. So, oh my. Is that how much difference an overlay versus a soft light makes here? Yeah, it is quite different. Overlay is actually a little nicer. Maybe I should stick with the overlay. You know, I'll think about it. First things first, let me get this, set its luminosity, turn it down to 20%. I'll leave it on 25 because I want things to be a little darker. So what's darker, above or below? Below looks a little darker. Let's make a duplicate of that, and then put it above, then set that to color burn. This is definitely darker. What about 10% on that? Definitely darker. So now what if I switch this to an overlay? It's not significantly different, it's just darker. Let's stick with overlay. Stick with overlay. It's a little different than what we'd normally do. I would normally just use a soft light layer for my primary gradient map, but let's leave it on an overlay, so that's a little bit more aggressive. The overlay is typically more vivid, largely, which is normally why I don't really use it so much, because it doesn't typically fit the color tones that I already have. I'm grabbing my texture now, and I'll put that over everything. That's right. Let's stretch this texture over the whole thing, set this to an overlay, and set this to 20%. Let's have a look. It sort of, again, it disperses through the background nicely. Now I will say this is definitely significantly more vivid than I would normally go for, because well, on the screen in front of me here, it's definitely a lot more vivid. On the monitor, it's not quite so bad. Yeah, the sort of way that the texture hits the background is a lot more visible than the way it hits the character. It's fairly subtle on the character, but that's largely due to our overlay, to be honest with you. It's not amazingly visible. It's visible on sort of the beige parts with the coat. And it's just because the red is so vivid. Because typically I prefer Hellboy having a pretty vivid skin tone, so I typically stick with that. Yeah, the smoke, obviously, that sort of gets hit by the texture quite a bit. But that's fine. It's the same with the background. It's fine with the background sort of dispersing up like that. That's kind of what we want to happen anyways. But yeah, the overlay, as I say, is typically not what I would use for my gradient map, because typically it's very vivid and it's a little bit sharp on the eyes. The soft light normally leaves things in such a way where it tends to be a little bit more natural. It tends to be a slightly more vivid version of the tones that I've already set. For example, let's just remove all that. That's significantly duller than what we've got with the overlay on. I could even give you a good example by just using the color picker and then picking that. That's now off into this gray area over here, which is the unprintable region. Not that I'm actually going to print this, so it doesn't really matter. But yeah. Anyways, I think that is us done, more or less. Yeah, that was a fairly easy one. It was a pretty short one, 3 hours and 10 minutes. So yeah, pretty easy. Which I can live with that. I'm perfectly happy with an easy one every now and then. But yeah, I mentioned before that I sort of lost the ability, or in an earlier episode, that I sort of had intended on doing a sort of Halloween selection. This is all obviously released quite a bit after. I don't know when this will release, but it certainly won't be October anymore by the time this releases. Might not even be November anymore. But yeah, So I had intended this to be one of my my sort of October selection. It was supposed to be part of last year's October selection, but I ended up just picking a different character. I think I forget what I ended up doing instead. But Hellboy was supposed to be one of the characters I did for the October selection originally for the sort of Halloween couple. Yeah, for the couple of ones that would release around Halloween, and so I had initially intended on doing that this year, but because I sort of I misjudged my time on some of these, and so I ended up recording too many earlier on, and then I didn't realize by the time that I'd scheduled them that they'd actually be covering the October period. So I was like, well, it's too late to change it now, and I don't have enough time to record. And well, the thought was at the time, I don't have enough time to record through all of these. I mean, it's nearly Halloween at the time of recording this, so I really wouldn't have had the time to go through and record all of these anyways. So yeah, anyways, I got to do it at the very least. So yeah. And Hellboy isn't necessarily the most Halloween-y character. It's just, I suppose, the theming is sort of what I was sticking with before. But anyways, that's enough. That's enough jibber jabber. I think it's time to wrap up and say goodbye. So yes, that is us. So if you like the video, do whatever it is that you'd normally do, whether that be liking or not. I, of course, prefer if you liked it, but I can't make you do that, so all I can do is politely suggest it, which I believe I have done. It's the same deal if you want to subscribe. Go for it. I can't make you do it. I would, of course, like if you did. No pressure. You've presumably seen a YouTube video before, so you know where the subscribe button is. It's below the video, in case you needed a reminder. And yeah, if you have a suggestion for what you'd like to see me draw in the future, you could leave a comment, politely worded, or not at all. If you're not going to do it politely, just don't do it at all. And so yeah, if you choose to watch the next video, I will see you next time. So with all that said, that is us. I'll say goodbye, and then I will leave you. So, bye-bye.